Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this roundtable. We're very happy to welcome you here. We're going to talk about one of the hot spots of the tech planet, Southeast Asia, a region which deserves being known. Very innovative, young, connected. A lot of success stories to talk about innovation, progress, and diversity. Some inequalities. So Southeast Asia, a land of opportunity, or a mirage. So we'll ask the question to our panelists of this session. I will introduce them to you, starting from the right. Ming Po Kai, who's president and founder of Cathay Capital, investment fund and venture capital. European investment fund that invests everywhere, the worldwide, notably in Southeast Asia. Sandiaga Uno, former Minister of Tourism in Indonesia. A very important businessman around Jakarta. And then you have Arnaud Vessier, president of International SOS, also the member of MEDEF International. And he will talk about this region. And Ravindra Ngo, founder of the Asian Network, a business network in the Southeast Asia region. But first, the floor is to Marie-Françoise Renard, an economist specialist of development, notably in Asia. We'll go back on Southeast Asia later as a political and economic entity. So how was the Asian developed? Thank you. Thank you. I think that to better understand the development of the Southeast Asian countries, you must remember that when Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Singapore, of course, founded the ASEAN in 1967. It was during the Cold War, and their first objective was to limit the expansion of communism. So the objective was, first and foremost, political, and to stabilize the zone and enable economic development. So countries that for most were quite poor countries, and the question that rose was to find out if it was a community in a list of countries that are very different in terms of history, in terms of development, political regime. And we see that over a few years, the objective was to support the national identity to manage to develop a community. So the objective is complex, difficult. It was partially achieved. One of the major events, can't talk about the different steps, so I have no time for that, but it's the creation through the initiative in Indonesia of the RCEP, this treaty of free trade that gave a pivotal role to the Asian countries. And so there are two phenomena that fostered the integration of ASEAN. The first of these phenomena was the Plaza Agreements in 1985, which decided on a re-evaluation of the Japanese yen, which affected the competitiveness of Japanese companies. The government, in a commercial war with the U.S., decided to improve the added value of its production and asked its corporations, companies that were relocalized in Malaysia and neighboring countries to reorient their production toward export rather than serving the national market. So we had the first step towards an integration through direct FDIs in the region. The same thing happened during the reevaluation of the South Korean currency and Taiwan currency. The second event was the opening up of China and its economic model. As you know, this opening was founded on the creation of a specific economic zone on growth and the growth of FDIs. The development of FDIs. So at the beginning, more than 90% of FDIs in China came from Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, thanks to the Chinese diaspora. And as of 2005, same phenomenon was observed. The government decided to improve the quality of growth, its growth. So the renminbi was devaluated, which of course impacted on the competitiveness of companies. And we had the first waves of relocalization in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, so on and so forth. What these countries share in common is to consider that development must be founded on industrialization, and they will adopt a model, most of them, the wild goose model, defined by a Japanese economist. It's a development that will concern poor countries, often agricultural countries, which start by importing low technology content products. Then they will transform them and export them, and with the income improve their own production level, their own technology, and so delocalize in poor countries. And this model was followed by most of the countries. So they will rely for this on developing states, that is, strategic countries that will implement an industrial strategy based on institutions that they control. Countries who are responsible for the development of these countries. So they work on the long run. They rely on planning, they rely on development agencies and special policies, so exchange rates, tax breaks to attract foreign investments in special economic zones, and also subsidies for export. So I have no time to develop all this, but there are some very original approaches that were implemented in these Asian countries with a common ruling, that is, we control the efficiency of these subsidies, and they grant subsidies first and foremost to companies that prove to be capable of exporting. The other common element is the recognition of the pivotal role of education. Very large investments in education, vocational training, R&D, but also the protection of copyright, of copywriting. So they have skilled labor, and it was much easier to adopt the new technologies. The best known example is the fintech in Singapore, that is now the fourth financial market worldwide, behind London, New York, and Hong Kong. And most of the larger cities in Southeast Asia saw their innovation index rise in recent years. Most of these countries have managed to create an environment that is very favorable to innovation. For example, the creation of startups and artificial intelligence, digital economy, and so on and so forth. And this integration was considered as a success. And so they created integrated circuits for electric vehicles, for example. Ore came from Indonesia and the Philippines, iron ore, and batteries came from Malaysia and other countries, semiconductors from yet other Asian countries. And so there's an economic integration that is carried out in the production chain. So we can see a remarkable result in the adoption of these new technologies, whether the digital economy, smart cities, and what have you. And so the limit is that there's a strong dependency to foreign innovation. Now, obviously, Vietnam exports high technology goods, but it's a foreign technology, imported technology. The telephones exported by Vietnam in the US are manufactured by Samsung, and they're not a Vietnamese innovation. And so there is this restriction, this limit, as well as the financing of infrastructure, which is phenomenal in Indonesia, Vietnam, and it's a key element for the economic development. But this financing is mostly Chinese, and it depends on Chinese investments. Today we can note that the implementation of the Trump tax rulings had a big impact. The Prime Minister of Indonesia reminded a few days ago that we needed to have a common response to that. It's very difficult because some countries like Vietnam, for example, thought that it would have a better capacity to negotiate with Trump. We know the bamboo diplomacy of Vietnam, which tries to negotiate with everybody. But today it's an objective that is a bit difficult to reach in these negotiations. We can draw a learning from all this, is that contrarily to what international institutions recommended, is that we consider that we can observe that the industrialization supported by a strategic state with a modern planning and a very high level of education can allow a poor country to improve the standard of living of its population and pull out most of its populations from poverty and become an innovative economy. Faced to this, we can conclude, raise a question, is that in a context where these countries try to diversify their commercial partners to limit risks. What should be the strategy of Europe, and what can be the place of Europe in this part of the world? Thank you, Marie-Françoise, for this brilliant presentation. Thanks. The floor is now to Ravindra Ngo. You were from Cambodia, founder of a think tank. Who are the actors who are moving in Southeast Asia? Can you do a mapping of the situation? First of all, thank you to the Rencontre économique d'Aix-en-Provence for inviting me here. I was born a few hours from here. I was born in Antibes. Reminds me of my childhood. So thank you for being here today to this session. So just to give you, before going into the mapping, as Odd said, of the Southeast Asia, a map of Southeast Asia, the IMF has observed the growth trend to 3.9%. So they lowered the trend due to the geo-economical and geopolitical context. But Southeast Asia remains a very attractive zone. In fact, in market size, we count about 670 million inhabitants for medium age level of 31 years old, so great growth and demographic potential. So I will now try to structure my paper, my presentation. I will focus on three axes. First of all is to better understand why the Southeast Asia zone is an attractive zone. Well, first of all, the demography and economic trends. We have an ecosystem that is very favorable for this. In Southeast Asia, we have about 50 unicorns. One who's extremely important, we have someone from Indonesia, which is called Bujek. I think they have a valorization at $10 billion, or euros. And Kajek is a startup specialized in transport and mobile payments, the equivalent of Grab and in other Southeast Asian zones. So it's an example. And the demography, as I said in my introduction, with a median age of 31 years, so very young population. In terms of demography, great potential. And also we have hubs, centers in Southeast Asia like Singapore, Jakarta, Ho Chi Minh City, which are attracting young talents today, not only in Southeast Asia, but also from Europe and other continents. So this is also a very strong trend for Southeast Asia. And also, I think that the sector or sectors, the important sectors in terms of technology are fortunately the fintechs. We also have agritech and restech. I think that later a lot of investors are focusing on these sectors. So this is the first point. Secondly, it's the support, government support, but also of conglomerates that we call the GAFAMs, Amazon, Google, which are not relocalizing, but in fact they are setting up their subsidiaries in Southeast Asia. And so this, of course, attracts new talents. It gives a better visibility on a zone, an emerging zone. And also at the government level, we have several recommendations or setting up of political rules. With the example of Singapore, they try to ensure what they call the Vision 2023, which is called the Smart Nation. They try to benefit to the population with the implantation of tools, digital tools in the tech world that has a very strong impact on the well-being of the population. We have the example of Thailand also. Thailand is one of the specificity of the Thailand population is that 15% of the population is over 65. So everything dealing with the silver economy, for this population, aging population, while the Thai government obviously is very much interested in this age group and is setting up quite a lot of programs as far as infrastructure. The development of the smart city also is very much involved in that. And I think, lastly, that along these axes, the third one, and you saw in different leaflets of this event, there is a strong investment on the pillar of AI. AI, generative or predictive AI, we see in the field of health, also, but for the environment, I think they plan the weather forecast, say 40 degrees today, where there's one heat wave peak that is expected today. In fact, this revolution of AI will enable to predict the trends, scenarios, and anticipate the major risks we should expect ecologically, but also at the level of our health. And this is a trend I'm observing in Southeast Asia. And on top of all this, I think the opportunities that it facilitates or it fosters is inclusion. There's one of the specificities of the region of Southeast Asia is that you have a lot of disparities. Disparities of population. Indonesia had more than 270 million inhabitants, I think. So, and in Brunei, 480,000 inhabitants, I think so. And so, economically speaking, I think Singapore is $28,000 of GDP per inhabitant, compared to Myanmar, I think it's $1,700 US. So major disparities. Another difference in Southeast Asia, or disparity, is the proportion of the rural populations and urban populations. So the AI, fintech, finance, and technology will probably remediate this fragmentation and differences. It will sort of smoothen the disparities. Besides the strengths, we also talk about weaknesses in terms of technological innovation. There are several, but I can maybe mention a few. The first is the protection of data protection. In fact, there's also another major stake. This is covered in the media often. It's everything related to the cities, countries in Southeast Asia, such as Thailand, Myanmar, and Cambodia, where you have a lot of cyber scam presence, a lot of cybersecurity issues, I think, exploitation of data. This is a major issue. And as I said, it's also the disparity as far as digital infrastructure that we can find. So the situation is very different. For example, in Singapore, the rate of internet covering is maximum, but if you go to the rural areas in the provinces of Cambodia or others, there we lack a lot of coverage or digital infrastructure. So this is very mapping in a nutshell of the situation. I think the vision of ASEAN, as you said, is a vision. ASEAN, for the moment, is located in Malaysia. They talk about a vision 2050, aiming at strengthening this axis of digital transformation, which in fact is valued quite a lot at $230 billion in 2026, valorized. But the other idea is to capitalize on R&D, and they also want to ensure the development for a creative economy. So this is in a nutshell what I wanted to say. Thank you. Floor is Arnaud Vessier.
Macron.
So you were with Emmanuel Macron last month when he went to Southeast Asia, particularly when he was in Singapore and Indonesia. And what struck you when you were there? What was the best practice that you identified? Not the slap when he got off the plane, but something else that you saw when you were there. Yes, there were two economic delegations that were with President Macron when he went to Singapore and Southeast Asia, and there were several economic agreements that were signed in Indonesia and in Singapore between French companies and Indonesians and Singaporeans. What's very interesting for us is that there's a real appetite in Indonesia and even more in Singapore for French interests, French companies, and the French economy. What was said on ASEAN is, I share that, but you can't forget the importance of China, which is the lungs, which has been having an impact. Traditionally, it was the United States that was driving these countries, but now China is an essential player in this region. So all the Asian countries, particularly Singapore, would like to establish a balance, and Europe is a natural partner to try to balance this very conflictual relationship between the US and China and the Asian countries that are between the two that have to stay friends with China because they're a huge power in the region and they will remain so. And the US, which was traditionally the protector of these countries against communism. So what we saw were significant economic agreements. In Singapore, 20 agreements were signed. And what's interesting is that out of the 20, 15, the three-quarters concern tech and innovation. For example, a national program for robotics in Singapore and the CNRS together to create a new institute, a new ecosystem that would work on robotics and artificial intelligence. Or Thales, with the Economic Development Board, they're creating their fourth artificial intelligence center. So these agreements have a significant scope, but I would like to come back to what I said earlier. Singapore is an example of an economy managed French style, but why are the results different? That's what's interesting. GDP per inhabitant is top in the world of all the developed countries, at the same level as Switzerland, 115,000 Singaporean dollars, 85,000 euros roughly, so very high. When I went to Singapore in '85 and I spent 14 years there, Singapore was still a poor country. In 60 years, they went from a very poor country without resources to one of the richest one in the world, with a very French system, with powerful public service, with brilliant people that manage the economy. So what is the difference with France? The difference is the Economic Development Board, which is the orchestra leader of the Singapore economy, is very interesting in this field, 850 people, a small organization, but one that works on long-term plans, 5-year plans, like the French used to do. And these 5-year plans focus on 3 words: research, innovation, and commercialization. They get funding for 5 years, and if after 4 years, when the funding is to be renewed, if they cannot show that the plan will lead to commercialization, they drop it and move on to something else. The second element is that everything is done for development not to go through the public sector, but rather the private sector. The private sector in Singapore, there are state companies, private companies, and foreign investors. Singapore is the number 4 recipient of foreign investment across the world, but they only have a population of 6 million people. Their proportion is quite extravagant. Another obsession in Singapore is to maintain the proportion of manufacturing industry. They have the highest revenue in the world, so high costs, But nevertheless, they maintain 22% of PNB, GNP, which is already substantial, and they want to increase it. There's something that they do that's very different than what we do. This Economic Development Board is looking constantly at sectors of the future, and they let go of the ones that have reached the summit of the growth curve. An example, which is an old one but is very telling, in the 1990s, they had 50% of the production of hard drives in the world. 50% was produced in Singapore, and the EDB decided that this industry had no growth prospects anymore. So they pushed all of these companies that were producing hard drives to Malaysia. They pushed all of the investment and the promotion of Singapore to semiconductors. And this is something that they do all the time. They change sectors very quickly and regularly, and they abandon other ones. This strength, this ability to identify the sectors of the future and giving up on those sectors of the past. Let me tell you another interesting point about Singapore. The de Gaulle or Churchill of Singapore had identified that China was going to become a great power. This was in 1990. China was just beginning to open up in the early 1980s. And for this, he decided that the population of Singapore, where he had bet on English, now had to learn Mandarin. And any Singaporean of Chinese origin in Singapore, so 72% of the population, overnight could go into university if they could be bilingual in Mandarin. And now the Chinese of Singapore are trilingual. English, they speak English and Mandarin. So this ability to project to the future and to ferociously invest in the future is one of their recipes for success. There's AI. They call themselves a smart nation. They identified this 15 years ago. A smart nation allows all of the Indonesian, Singaporean population, Singaporean companies to learn AI in their education system, to use it, including the silver economy in Singapore, because they have a demographic problem with population aging. So they all know how to use AI in everyday life. Thank you for this presentation, Arnaud. I'm going to pass the floor to the Minister Inigo. So the innovations, do they meet the societal challenges, and what is still left to do in this field? So you're going to speak in English.
Thank you for having me on this conference. And I was recently toured the Southeast Asia. It's 10 countries from Myanmar, Cambodia, went to Vietnam, also to Thailand, obviously Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. And if you look at the Southeast Asia region, you will see obviously Singapore on the top of the GDP per capita, but you also have challenges. You cannot look Southeast Asia with one sort of like view and perspectives, but Southeast Asia is very, very diverse and very unique. And the most important thing, it's rising. The economic growth is increasing, and Indonesia, being half of Southeast Asia in terms of populations, in terms of the economy, really is now shaping up under our new president. Our new president loves France, and I think Arnaud experienced both President Macron and President Prabowo do a karaoke sing for 20 minutes, and they sing French song. In fact, when I used to help Pak Prabowo develop the economic platform of his party, he would spend, I think, few weeks of a year here in Paris. He speaks the language. And I think when I ran with him at the 2019 presidential elections, I learned that we have so much potential, not just Indonesia, but as regions as a whole. And I would like to touch on what would drive Southeast Asia and how we could collaborate. First is the innovations. It is a very, very innovative region. But secondly, that is very important, is it is a very, very adaptive. We quickly adapt. You mentioned about Singapore adaptations. We adapt to democracy not too long ago, about 25 years ago, on a full-fledged democracy. And we do it with collaborative measures, as ASEAN was started in 1967. So it is not just about high tech, but high touch. With very diverse culture, Southeast Asia is meeting local wisdom with global ideas. I also would like to say that the innovations is the grassroots innovations. It's not just the high-tech, rocket science, AI, robotics, but it is something that we do every day, like agricultural, fishery. You mentioned about Gojek, but there are other innovations, like there is a InsurTech company that collects your Garmin data now in Indonesia to translate into a very unique premium base on your health. So if you exercise more, you pay less premium for your insurance. So there are many of this coming up in Southeast Asia. So we just don't need unicorns. We have 50 unicorns, but we have an ability to create sociopreneurs, social entrepreneurs. Secondly, it is about the SMEs. Many agreements were struck during President Macron's visits to Southeast Asia, but the one that will drive the growth and the economic integrations would be the 64 million SMEs in Indonesia, plus other SMEs that drive more than 60% of the GDP and create good quality jobs. Around 90% of the jobs are created by the SMEs. So if you want to look at Southeast Asia, look at the SME sectors. From the coffee stall in Cambodia to, I would say, fashion designer in Indonesia, all the way to the craftsman in Thailand. If you watch The White Lotus, where Thailand was able to create this very innovative way of Netflix blockbusters, tourism, but also creative economy. And it is a high-tech that everyday's use. We use it on everyday's life, and it touches lives. So I was able to, during my years in the public life, created a couple of movements, the SME movements that create close to 600,000 jobs, and also an innovations and technology movement that handles some of these grassroots innovations that's now seeing from the Golden Village to Tourism Village program. And I believe that we in ASEAN will be not just taking care of the borders, but we're building bridges. And it is an innovation bridges that connect Singapore to some of the most challenging regions within the Southeast Asia. And Indonesia have great program, like shifting some of the inefficiency of the government budget to the free nutritious meal that you talk about, Arnold. It's going to open up a lot of opportunity for SMEs, in particular within the food and energy sector. So finally, I want to close to a call to actions to everybody. So let's create these collaborations within Southeast Asia and Europe, in particular French. And it is going to be based on value-driven innovations that would be meaningful to the people and create prosperity together. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Minister. It's now Mingpo Kai, you're the founder of the Cathay Capital Investment Fund. It's a fund that invests across the world. You would like to tell us about how you understand projects, how you decide to invest in Southeast Asia. Do you say that it's because the markets are huge or very populated, or it's because the population is very young, very connected, very captive, if you like? We see opportunities everywhere. Cathay manages $5 billion in our fund, and we opened an office in Singapore 10 years ago. I come from Fujian, from a big, in all the big industrial families in Southeast Asia, we speak the same dialect. I'm delighted to see you here. If I talk about Southeast Asia, the Pacific region, we have several big companies involved in fintech. It's one of the biggest fintech companies in Southeast Asia. Financed has made banks more democratic, more accessible. We're listed on the NASDAQ. Cham is certainly a pioneer and an example of a financial company, one that we made accessible to make banking activity possible to the highest number of people. As a financial company that serves its country, but also does it across the world, starting with Indonesia. We invested in a company called Rubello to recycle telephones and for household goods. This company is based in Southeast Asia, but they exported the model to the United States. And I went with them to San Francisco, and they've become a leading company in the United States now. And there's also a company that's made insurance more accessible to the populations. So tech is great, but it's better to apply tech. Applications give solutions for the highest number in the population. So financing the founder, Maclin, in India, in Indonesia. The founder of Rebello is a French person, a bit Singaporean, and have lived in Southeast Asia for a long time. So what am I trying to say here? Today, we're talking a lot about Southeast Asia. I was joking with Hervé Lorenzi. We're not talking about China, we're talking about Southeast Asia. Are you doing this seriously or not? I said. I agree. In the past, we were only talking about Asia. We talked about the Far East. You can't include China anymore. It's too big. So we're calling it Southeast Asia. But there's a long list of companies, a long list of countries in this region. Technology must make it possible for us to unite and to create bridges. You're right. We are building bridges today. So without talking about China or the US, we have to look at both of them. We can't oppose them. How many Chinese tech companies are in Southeast Asia? And we also have to understand that the market is very important in the United States because they're behind our startups. I think that economies need to stay connected. If we don't build bridges, we can build tunnels. We're creating a connection, and I know the people in person. And I'm not just talking about systems. And today, the talents and the depth of the Southeast Asian economy linked to this opening There are many Chinese people who are here, and not only Chinese people, there are lots of Americans and Indians who are meeting. Is the market deep now? I say not deep enough yet. The market is still in its early stages.
So it's a big mistake. The Southeast Asia, they follow their own path. They embrace AI and tech. But what I recommend is that we should concentrate on applications and the final usage of all this. And it should be for the masses and not to recreate or to supply the ultra-rich as we experience whether in the United States or China. I'm for the application of tech applications, and I developed a lot of activity in China. We have almost 2 billion euros creating vertical funds in China, very specific to curb the issue. It's useless to tell good stories if we don't solve the problems. So I think in Southeast Asia we have to identify the problems, mobilize talent, mobilize resources, whether local, Chinese, American, or all over the planet. If it's human intelligence, well, it should serve a good cause. Human intelligence has to serve a good cause. I think that's my vision. Thank you. So we will react with the rest of the panel. A subsidiary question, Mingpo, because you talked about the links of Southeast Asia with China, with what's happening in a world that is more and more fractured. Can Southeast Asia find its independence towards China? Can you break the ties? I don't know why we want to split up the people. Well, you know, we're all together here on this table. No, it's not a good idea to break ties. Sometimes China makes us afraid. It's because we don't understand China. The Chinese are innocent, like the French, like the U.S. Why does China move so fast, especially in AI? Well, they have an exceptional quality of data. You have a very digital economy in China. So they have a database, the quality of data. And it's like our body. When they eat good food, if you have good ingredients, you digest fast. Instead of taking 24 hours to digest, well, every 8 hours you digest. So if you eat good data, it's the same, and your body becomes stronger, and your intelligence is sharper. And when you are obsessed for usefulness and practical applications, well, you see in France you have new trades that have appeared, new jobs in batteries and electric cars and what have you. So we shouldn't sanction the people who do better, but we need to collaborate. And in Indonesia, they gave the example to attract industrialists of the world over, including Chinese, to come and set their companies locally. So what should we ask the Chinese? This is a secret I want to share with you. There's a secret. China, 30 years ago when they opened up, they called the Western world to come to China, do the technological transfer, set up their companies industrially. Well, do the same. The Chinese had a good understanding situation, whether in France or Southeast Asia. You know, you have to do the same. At Cathay, we're very present in Europe. We have 4 representations, 4 offices in Paris, Germany, Spain. And for a long time also, we're at Atam in Africa. We have a partnership with local partners there. And I think that a company like Cathay, we're very deep-rooted. I'm from Aix. You know, welcome here. This is my home. And the root has to be deep. The roots have to be deep. And we have to be there to contribute to the ecosystem. If I came to Aix, it's not to water my plants and everything. The land won't like that. I think that we have to establish ties together, relationships. We're like 6 trees here around this table. If we have the common roots, we're all connected, and then we're a real platform, we're a force, we're a solution. Thank you, Mingpo. Ravindra, would you like to react on this geopolitical aspect? You, who talk with these business people in the region, do you see them as being increasingly interested by the U.S. or frightened what's happening? How do they react? Well, Thank you for this question. First of all, I go along with what Minpao said. We're all connected through differences in Asia culturally, the disparities, differences I mentioned earlier. I think, in fact, if we have the will to do the right things in the tech, invest on social platforms and things, I think it's a common vision we should all have in the region. But to respond to your question, reply to your question, I think that in the Southeast Asian region, I don't like to say battles, but to use the word battles, but there's a rivalry between the powerful China and the U.S. And there is a geostrategic interest of the Indo-Pacific zone outside of the Southeast Asian zone, Indo-Pacific zone, which is growing. And so I think recently the visit of Emmanuel Macron, the French president, in Indonesia, and then in Vietnam, and he ended at one of the largest summit in Shangri-La, Singapore, defense summit in Asia, the largest, the most important summit in Asia. So that's an indicator. And then what choices should investors, business leaders turn to? Well, that's a difficult question to address because there are some countries of Southeast Asia which are very strongly tied to China, have strong relationships with China. It's the case of Cambodia. We can mention Laos and Myanmar, and some that are more towards the U.S., like the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, but others who are more on the neutral side and who have a good understanding of the chessboard, making reference to the book by Brzezinski, with a view to this strategic positioning. I think that if we consider, I think that today's session is on Southeast Asia, but I would like to eventually bring some fuel for thought, what we can learn from each other. The EU and ASEAN and the EU. I think Santiago mentioned this. Santiago mentioned the fact that Europe can learn from agility, the efficiency and resilience of Southeast Asia. Can learn on that. We see this because of the U.S. leadership with the tariffs, for example, custom tariffs. China and ASEAN had to strengthen their ties, notably with a partnership that already exists, the ASEAN +3, bring together ASEAN, China, and South Korea and Japan. But also recently during a summit, ASEAN, China, and the Gulf countries also strengthened their ties and form new alliances. So I think it's it's an opportunity stemmed by this crisis. And I think that what we can learn, Southeast Asia, ASEAN, and EU, what we learn from all this is that the EU has set up a lot of initiatives and on environmental issues. That's the first aspect. The second point that Southeast Asia could learn from Europe is a lot on ethical regulation. I think you published AI Policy Act, so that's a good example. Last question before handing over the floor to microphone to the floor. We talked about societal stakes. Is the environmental stake important in Southeast Asia? I think we've regressed on the environment. Is that something that is a concern in Indonesia, environmental aspects, environmental issues?
And I think Indonesia, and in particular Southeast Asia in general, is the epicentrum when you talk about green economies. There's so much opportunity that we could work together, be it from the tropical rainforest to mangrove to coral reefs restorations. We have a lot of potentials to bring in AI and the tech sectors to the green economy, not just agricultural and marine, but the entire ecosystem. I invested in a company that basically handle food loss and food waste. That would address around 30% less on carbon emissions. We're also looking at innovations that respond to climate change. I mean, we're in a heat wave right now, but in Indonesia, it's really, really hot also. So Southeast Asia, not only hot, but humid. And therefore, it is something that innovations needs to address the green challenges, food insecurity, and youth unemployment. Now, you guys probably watch the movie Crazy Rich Asia. Crazy Rich Asian is actually very misleading because most Southeast Asian is very frugal and very family friendly, very focused on circular economies. So I think there's a lot of works that could be done in that area. And I think within the next few years, there's an opening up of huge opportunities for us to create a shared solutions for green economy.
Merci, on va prendre quelques questions dans la salle. Il y a quelques minutes, tout devant, peut-être monsieur.
Questions from the floor. Sir, can you stand up and take a microphone, please? Just so we understand what you're saying, we hear what you're saying. So may I address my question in English or should I address in French for the minister?
Thank you. Raphael Salmi, I'm based in Singapore in the semiconductor industry. I think I agree with you. Indonesia is very fascinating with the population, but I'd like your opinion as a government representative on two items. Number one, a young population, but there is challenges in finding talented, and education is a big issue across the region, but more particularly in Indonesia. Second, the fragmentation of ASEAN, I think is an opportunity, but also a challenge. What's your view on creating a more homogeneous bloc, like eventually the European Union, to be in the middle of the power, economic power between China and the United States? Thank you.
Thank you. Youth unemployment is a very serious issue because we not only not able to produce jobs in general, but not being able to focus on the good quality jobs that adapt to the latest of technology. So I think this is where PPP, public-private partnership, needs to be in place to not only upskill, reskill, and new skill the young populations. In Indonesia, we have a few of that initiatives, and I think Singapore has great examples over there. And I think, silver economies is a $15 trillion potential opportunities, but the young unemployment needs to be addressed, and I agree with you, we need to move fast on this one. Secondly, I would say within the Southeast Asia sectors, not only technology, but also health and educations are great opportunities, and my opinion is, yes, we have challenges. The fragmentations is a challenge. I tried to create a Southeast Asia airline. It failed, although I invested together with Singapore Airlines. But I think there are models that work, like Air Asia, like DBS Bank is across Southeast Asia, and CIMB out of Malaysia. But we cannot create a homogeneous platform across Southeast Asia. Each countries would have local wisdoms and local strength and weaknesses, and therefore we need to integrate the economies.
Merci.
And maybe
Monsieur Sénégas,
maybe produce the best from each countries.
Je vais laisser le mot de la fin pour conclure à Marie-Françoise Renard.
Concluding words to Marie-Françoise Renard to conclude this roundtable very in a nutshell, just to remind you that in these systems in which institutions controlled by the state, as it was underlined by Arnaud, were very efficient, but they were accompanied by a lot of competition between private corporations and public corporations, startups and others. But it doesn't stop competition. And second point, I have 30 seconds. I'd like to go back on what was said on the importance of applications, the application of new technology to the whole of the population. Innovation should not lead to a fragmentation of the population between those who benefit from this innovation and others that are left aside or are the weakest. On the contrary, innovation should serve the whole of the population massively. And often the countries of Southeast Asia have better understood this than we have. So thank you, and be careful of the digital divide also. Thank you to all our speakers. I think hope you learned things during this session. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to introduce this session focused on the puzzles of birth rates. And so I'm going to present the speakers who've agreed to speak at this session. I'm going to start with Adrien Couret, who is the Chief Executive Officer of IME Group. IME Group, we know the massive Mutuelle Abair. Thank you for being with us. Then we've got Gala Diaz-Longu. You are from Argentina. You are the Executive Director of CPEC. This is an NGO based in Buenos Aires, which is the Center for the Implementation of Public Policies for Equity and Growth. And you're going to be speaking in French. Thank you very much. We've got Hervé Lebras, who's a demographer and historian. You are a research director at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, the Social Science School. Catherine Scornet, you are based at Aix-Marseille Université, and you work on reproduction in Asia in particular. And I'm going to be finishing with you, Claudia Senik. You are a member of the Circle of the Economists based in Paris. I'm going to hand over to you to present the issues of this session. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for being with us. So I want to open up on a session on a question which is a joyful question, but it's also a question of concern, because over the last few years we've been seeing fertility rates drop around the world. 2/3 of countries in the world have a fertility rate that is calculated as underneath the population replacement rate. And this is a kind of anthropological change in business models, evolutionary, sociobiological models. We tend to see human action as something which is driven by the desire to disseminate our genes, and to do this through reproduction. And what we seem to be observing is that populations and individuals seem to have put aside this objective. They want to have less children or even no children. And that's a fairly significant change, a radical change. Of course, we could say this was good news for the planet if there's less of us to exploit resources, but at the same time, in our societies, this raises a whole number of issues about thinking about our intergenerational relationships, our pension systems, where the pensions are paid for by people working. So this creates a whole number of issues. So what I'm doing here is presenting the issues of this session. What are the determining factors of this change? So there may be an eco-anxiety in the face of climate change and all that we're seeing here. There also may be geopolitical uncertainty which is contributing to this, and then perhaps at an individual level there's a new way of thinking about our lives, taking on our hands our own destiny, being a bit less altruistic perhaps, and then perhaps some negative questions about concerns about income and accommodation. And then the second issue would also be that children and the working for children, taking care of children, tends to weigh more still on women. So there's a lack of balance between partners. And this may also be one of the issues associated with this second demographic transition. And then we're going to be talking today about whether the public policies can impact this. Can fiscal approaches do something about this? Is something that we can do? Or once this cultural transition has been put in place, is it irreversible? So I think that's what really we're going to be talking about today in this panel session. That's right. So we're going to be starting with you, Catherine Scornet. Perhaps you could explain to us the deep reasons for this drop in fertility rates. So yes, questions associated with birth rates and reproduction. This has been a concern in France for some time now, particularly in France, whether from the medical and political world and from our economic leaders as well, because France has seen a very slow growth in its population since the 18th century, since it entered into a demographic transition. We were in 1750, we were 22 million. Now we are 68 million, which is unusual. So this is a country which aged very early, and fertility rates were among the first in the world to start dropping off. It's true that in 2024, the average number of women per woman, it's 1.62 today, but in our history there have been crisis points where this indicator has been low during periods of war, for example. In 1919, this number was at 106. In 1993, it was 1.66. So actually, when we look back over time, we can perhaps better understand the explanations for these different behaviors. So I don't have very much time to talk about this, but what I want to do, therefore, is concentrate on one aspect associated with the drop in fertility rates, and this is to do with the focus on individuals, and in particular, the fact that family behavior since the 1970s has significantly changed, with the drop-off of birth rates, the increase of recomposed families, all these changes happening in families which have been going on since the 1970s. This is all rooted in what was happening in the 18th century and the promotion of the individual, which gives today individuals the opportunity to live the life they want to live and to follow less strictly the instructions that come from authority figures, whether these are fathers or husbands, step-family, God, or the king. And so now individuals are free to live the life that they want to live. And the question of choice is fundamental, and the question of desire is fundamental. And this is something that is increasingly strengthened and has grown since the 1970s in particular. So in terms of this question of concentration on individuals, these changes are associated with increasing control of individual and family destiny. Of course, that's the legalization of contraception in 1969 and abortion in 1975 obviously impact the growing control of reproductive behavior, and this question of choice impacts us. So people no longer say, I will have as many children as God wants to give me or as my step-family want me to have, but people decide that they will have the number of children they want to have. So this process of concentration on individuals also has had the consequence that a whole number of differences are becoming legitimate. So people can be in a couple, they can not be in a couple, they can be married, not unmarried, they can cohabit, they can have children, they can not have children. Everyone has the choice. In France, the most recent survey on fertility, which was carried out by the INED in 2010, shows that in France, there is still a strong pressure to have children. Only 4% of French people, according to the survey, don't want to have children. So there remains a strong pressure to have children in France. Sorry, Catherine's gone now. I'm going to have to interrupt here. I'm afraid I have to play bad cop here. If you could just come to the conclusion. Well, yes, okay. Well, I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of things then. But really, to conclude, what I want to say is that individuals today are less attached to a particular status, the status of being a mother, being a father, being a husband, or being a wife. The status is tending to, this idea of status is tending to be pushed to one side, as opposed to the idea of having space for oneself and beyond this parental pressure, as it were. So this altruistic dimension to take care of our children, of course, that remains. But individual fulfillment is key. It's possible to make a decision about a fulfilled life without having children or having few children. Thank you very much. Claudia Senik, you were talking about inequalities in terms of between men and women, and of course this is still present in terms of daily tasks at home between men and women. Could you develop this a little bit? Yes, so two things. There was a recent article by a Nobel Prize economist which shows that countries that have developed a lot over the last 10, 20 years around the world, in these countries, women have started working and they've started to have professional aspirations. And this means they want to reconcile these aspirations with a career. But in these countries, men have not necessarily followed the movement. And they haven't really understood that there needs to be a better sharing out of these domestic tasks. And what we can see in these countries, fertility is dropping off much more than in other countries. So what we learn from this observation is that it is women who have children. It's they that are responsible at the beginning, as it were, for children. And so they need to be quite optimistic about what's going to happen once the child is born, in terms of the way that tasks at home are shared out. So in a publication that I published on this, there's a chapter, really very interesting chapter, from a sociologist who classifies countries on the basis of their optimism or their pessimism about being parents. So there are countries where women don't work and there's a very traditional share of domestic tasks. And then there are modern countries, like the countries in the north, where there's a real sharing out of domestic tasks, and women are working. And then there are countries like France, which are somewhere in the middle, where women are working, but there isn't yet really this sharing of the burden of domestic tasks. So in these countries, we can see that women are quite pessimistic about what things are going to be like if they have children. They're going to lose their freedom. They're not going to be able to work. And so this impacts fertility. And so if we want to really think about this demographic rearmament, which the president was talking about, we need to think about this. So we're obviously not going to tell people how they need to organize themselves at home, but through public policies we could put in place parental leave at different times. We can make it more flexible, like we see in Sweden and Denmark. We could change benefits for parents to encourage a better share of domestic tasks. In Sweden, there is a parental leave which is long if the father also takes time, and so this is a potential lever that we could use. Thank you very much, Hervé Lebras. You wanted to talk a little about the investment of parents in the education of their children, about choosing the quality rather than quantity of children. So you're saying that it's important to have a focus on the quality of education for children rather than having lots of children. Thank you very much. Yes, I just want to pick up on 3 points. As we've heard, this drop-off is general around the world, but particularly in Europe. But fertility rates in Europe are at about 1.45 children per woman. The more fertility was high in Europe, the more it's dropping off. there's a very clear convergence here. The standard type deviation is 0.18 in 2023. So the European family exists, but there are 1.45 exists. The correlation between this drop over the last few years and the fertility level of 2012 is 0.64, which is high. The second point is, if I just pick up what Claudia Senig said to us, there's this question of behavior in terms of inequality between men and women. In the qualification level of women was much lower in the past, and in France, reconciling a family life and a professional life meant for women having working 2 days every day. But now, actually, young generations of women are better qualified than men, and they're doing this in order to fill in this gap. People with qualifications of master's qualifications of 5 years after the age of 18 are much higher for women now, and this double day is no longer acceptable for women doing their professional work and then coming home to do all the domestic tasks and educating and raising the children. The third point, I would call this social capillarity. And there's another phenomenon here, which is to do with a slowing down of social mobility. Households are devoting more resources to social mobility than to reproduction. This may either be for themselves or for their children. For themselves, this is really very classical. This used to be called social capillarity. This is a term used by Arsène Dumont, a sociologist from the beginning of the century. It was the middle class that tended to have least children. That's still the case, and the reason that was put forward was because they tended to put their resources into social mobility. This is also the theme of the latest book by Émile Zola, which is called Fertility. And then the second possibility is the promotion of children, and that's what's increasingly having a role. The Chinese call this the little emperor role, the making sure that children have as much success as possible later on. This requires a lot of investment from parents, and we find these classical terms from economists, from the Gary Baker's treatise on the family, which is this debate between quantity and quality is opposed to the quantity of children. This is a theme that Gary Baker has shown and which applies all around the world and can be explained in economic terms. But with this stronger mobilization of resources because of the drop-off of social mobility, households tend to have less children. There's an extreme case of this. Gary Baker referred to this as a situation where the children benefits from everything, they receive everything. Children are very egotistical, they have no altruism. Thank you very much.
Profitons de votre présence.
We talked a lot about France. Maybe we should talk now about Argentina and Latin America. I think you wanted to address this concept of disaffiliation, social disaffiliation, how this hinders fecundity. Thank you, Sebastian. Good morning, everybody. So demography is not the other. It's become the mirror of our social society and a lever. So bring the voice of Latin America to this debate is to look at the phenomena in a region that is marked by inequalities and serious crisis of disaffiliation, particularly in Argentina, the country where I live. Disaffiliation impacts the links between individuals and institutions, whether political, public, private, social, and it initiates the trust in the authorities. 28% in Latin America and 17% in Argentina trust the governments. And it's also shown in the lack of religious approaches, the reduction of union or syndicate union commitments. But I would like to pause here on what Robert Castel considered as the last castle of the standing castle, which are the families. So the family approaches have changed. In the unipersonal households represent 25% of the total in Argentina. The poor households are more numerous with more children. We find single-parent families. And this change in deficit of convergence, socioeconomic convergence, is accompanied with a disaster at the individual level. The solitude is making progress. Between 25 to 30% of Latin Americans feel lonely, and the interpersonal trust has dropped. The aging of the population also fits in this context of disaffiliation. In Argentina, we observe a strong drop of births with a greater life expectancy, and several factors explain this drop. On the one hand, public policies luckily have enabled to reduce non-intentional pregnancies. The access to contraceptive solutions and information on sexual health has been developed. Education and the social cultural transformations have had an impact on preferences. And the decision of having or not having children, giving birth to children, is more and more influenced by the questioning during the last decade of maternity and paternity as a fundamental duty for the personal development. The increase in life expectancy contributes to postpone this decision. Economic uncertainties, pandemic, and climate change also has an impact on these choices. The feminization of the healthcare in Latin America also hinders the decision of becoming a mother. The families, and mainly women, still cover most of the care to the detriment of their careers and their professions and their professional lives. They spend 7 times more than men with unpaid work. When social links are fragilized and when institutions no longer protect, when founding a family becomes a risk and not a project. And while the family is the last bastion affiliation, its fragility marks the urgency of rebuilding strong links before the demographic collapse turns into a social collapse. So this challenge is the heart of the multiple crises that are found all over the world. And demography is not only a symptom of profound transformation, social cultural transformation, also impact the process of disaffiliation. The way we respond to this will determine our capacity to contribute to build a good future. So what we do now will define not only our demographic future, but also our political, economic, and human future. Transforming this transition involves political courage, structural investments, and chiefly, renewed social contract. This is our collective task. Thanks for your attention. Thank you. So last subject, Alain Couret, to talk about the causes in this drop of the birth of demography. We talked a lot today about the eco-anxiety. We talk a lot of how we're going to face the future risk, climate, with the climate and everything. Can you develop on that, please? First of all, good morning, everybody. I will start this brief comment. So why does a head of a company, why should he be interested in this drop in the birth rate? this is beyond, which something is beyond his reach. I think the question of how the birth rate and just like geological evolutions will affect different sectors of activities has not been broadly documented. And for me, in the insurance sector, it's a key factor because the insurer, what the insurer does is distribute the risks, but also between populations and generations on health, dependency, savings, even on mobility. A lack of conduct of the youth will have an impact in the future. So the question of birth rates is very important in terms of prospective. And beyond the aspects that we can discuss on the street is to better understand it. So it's work that we do, notably by listening and studying the works of the colleagues that are here at this round table. So a better understanding, and this was mentioned, is there a will to give birth to children in France, whether through injunctions or through a will? So when you consider the studies, the answer is yes. Several studies show that between 70-75% of women who do not have children and are in the age group to give birth, well, they are favorable to giving birth. So there's a contradiction between this drop in the birth rate and this desire of giving birth. So here there are two causes. Trust in the future, less children. We feel that there is an advanced signal of a lack of trust in the future, but other causes can be of a material order, and there are causes that are linked with mental, psychological reasons that are linked to projecting oneself in a common adventure. So concretely, if we look at the results of the surveys, if we interview the people involved, the major causes were already mentioned. It's the question of cost of living. Cost of living, everything that was raised, on other topics, in the cost of housing, the cost of food, of child care and everything. This has an impact on the capacity to project oneself in the future. And 72% of the women who are at the age of giving birth, they say that it's a major element for them, either to not have children or to postpone giving birth. So in the drop of fecundity, the children come later. They give birth to children later. And we will know we'll have the final figures only a few years from now. And back on your topic and on what our previous speaker said, 70% of the women say that they bear most of the parental load charge, and they think that their career will be penalized. And so there's another topic here, the relationship between people and the labor world. As insurers, we're often approached by the sector of health. And it's a topic that is linked to the medical aspects and is the issue of infertility, which can be documented as a global movement, but there's no fire without smoke without fire. There's a lot of research done, and endometriosis has become a pathology that is more and more studied, and taboos are falling. But this question of infertility is still a taboo, and it's an important psychological element. So there are material conditions, economic conditions linked to the better understanding of the human body, which are not lifted, and there is some anxiety with the view to the future. And not only eco-anxiety is the most vast phenomenon. Every year our AMA group, we have an observatory on protection, so we interview a lot of people on their relationship with protection and their relationship with the future. The marking phenomenon since the end of the COVID, between 2021 and today, if we look at the measures taken, the proportion of French people who declare they don't feel well protected has doubled from 17 to 34%. And among the causes that can explain this, everything's increasing in terms of concerns, but the eco-anxiety is really a key element. And when you pull, when you continue here, the fact of not being able to live on the planet anymore in the future, but and also the climate, is linked with the fact that we no longer believe that we can work together or have trust in a world that is livable whether economically but socially. And when you turn on the television and we talk more about retirement than births, and we talk more about air conditioning than climate, and generally speaking, the debate around us is more made up of fragmentations than collective approaches. So it's not very reassuring for people. So this is probably another cause for the lowering birth rate. It's difficult to talk about birth rates and birth policy and the policies to that effect. So Hervé Lebras, the floor is yours. We see that a lot of countries like France set up policies, but we realize that they're not really efficient. A lot of work is being done, notably economically. There are very few impacts of policies. I was asked to talk about two countries and about France. Russia, Putin is obsessed by the birth rate. As of 2007, he proposed a premium to young couples to have a child, a bonus, and this premium is a loan that is not necessarily reimbursable. Fecundity rate was 1.6. It rose to 184 in 2012. And he found it was not enough, so he added, notably Medvedev allocated land to the families who could have a third child. And since 2012, nevertheless, despite this arsenal, and the Russian fecundity rate were at 1.49, and it seems to be dropping. Second country, Hungary. Orban is a fanatic of birth rates and natality, but all the measures he took, which are comparable to Russia, to those of Russia, but trying to maintain women at home as housewives, they have a tax incentive for the households that have more than 4 children, so no taxes. It's very expensive, but the result is not perceived, is not seen, because when we talk about the evolution of the fecundity index, neighboring country, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, they're evolving the same way without the incentives at the same level. And even last year, Hungary had a very strong drop, where they're now at 1.38 child per woman. So justice for these two countries. For France, I just want to focus on the criticisms that were made, saying that the fact that Hollande, on condition of revenue, there were some family allowances that were changed and everything, and that hindered fecundity. There was a nice, very interesting study that was done calculating on the kind of revenue, the relationship between the income and the fecundity, the birth rate. So it dropped by 0.12. So it went from, we're talking from 1.8, and it dropped by 0.12 due to this measure. And it dropped by 0. So the drop is 0.015, since it represents 2/5 of the population. 0.015. The final result is 0.06 in the fecundity index. So the fecundity index, which is 1.815 2019, it will be 1.956 if you didn't have Hollande's measure. So you see there that the measure did not hinder the fecundity rate or the birth rate. But we could compare this drop linked to family allowances of 0.006 to the drop last year of French fecundity rate, which was 0.12, i.e. 20% higher. And we don't understand why. The same drop took place in Germany, but a year earlier. But there's no explanation to this phenomenon. So we can follow month after month the birth rate compared to the previous year, and for 2025 the drop is 3%. So the fecundity rate in France next year will probably be 1.57. Could be some extraordinary circumstances, but nevertheless.
Public, alors c'est vrai qu'il y a une région du monde où c'est un
Okay, this is obviously an important subject. We can see that in China and Southeast Asia, even there, what they're putting in place there is not really having a lot of impact. Well, yes, I could talk about fertility in Asia. This is a vast area, so I'm going to focus on Eastern Asia and Southeast Asia, because East Asia is seeing the lowest fertility rates in the world at the moment. For example, in Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, South Korea, fertility rates are at 0.7 children per woman at very low levels. So what characterizes this region of the world, it's not just that, but what we've seen is a drop-off in fertility, a very quick drop-off since the 1970s. So in 1970, a Chinese woman used to have 6 children, and now she would just have 1.2. So in just a single generation, we've got rapid change in reproductive behavior, which has created an accelerated aging of the population and has also led to drastic changes in demographic policies in China. You know that since 2016, China has not abandoned its one-child policy. That happened much earlier, but from 2016 it started promoting a policy of 3 children per family. Vietnam, which is a big country in the world because now has a population of over 100 million, it also had drastic limitation policies in the 1970s. On the 5th of June this year, it decided to abolish its policy of reducing birth. So these countries that had drastic limitations in place, they're now turning their backs on those policies and trying to change direction. In terms of these very low fertility rates that we have in Hong Kong, the main cause of this, so later on I'll come to the social causes, but the key cause would be to the increase in definitive infertility. What I mean by this is the fact that women have never had children during their fertile life. And in Hong Kong, a woman who was born in 1972, who's now over 50, who's no longer of childbearing age, 35% of these women have not had children. This is a very high rate. In Japan, they're at second place on this figure at 28%, children of the same generation. And Singapore, the rate is 26%. So these countries are at the top of the definitive infertility rate indicator. And these countries are then followed by Germany, and then Italy. France is significantly below this because it's only 13% of women of this generation who have never had a child. So what is this definitive infertility associated with? Well, it's linked to an increase in definitive celibacy. And that means that in these countries, marriage and births are very closely linked. So it means that only 2 or 3% of births take place outside marriage. So there's not been a change in family structures that we can see, for example, in France. Because in France and in other countries in Northern Europe, which have changed in different ways, there's been an increase in free relationships of different types. In France today, 65% of births take place outside marriage. So in Southeast Asian countries, there is still this social construct, which means that it's not possible to have children if you're not married. So this means that women either get married and have children, or they don't get married and they won't have children. So you can see that a French woman is never going to ask herself the question about whether she's going to work or whether she's going to have children. Whereas these women in Asia have to ask themselves this question: am I going to work or am I going to have children? And for the moment, there's no alternative. And there's nothing that can be observed in terms of change of family behaviors, in terms of a concentration of births within marriage. So why do we observe these low fertility rates? Hervé Lebras or Adrien they've said this already. In these countries in Southeast Asia, where there's a very strong social status associated with qualifications. So this links into Confucian countries where the value of an individual depends a great deal on their qualification. It's a high status symbol to have a qualification, and the cost of education is exorbitant in these countries. There's a private system which is not funded by the state, and in addition, parents are pushed to see their children succeed by going into very selective universities, and they therefore pay for private lessons, which are also extremely expensive. So the cost of education could be an important factor. The cost of housing in these city-states, Singapore, Hong Kong, and others. And I should wrap up there because I've spoken for too long. But just to conclude, there is this idea of a very gender-linked social construction in terms of behavior within family. I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but we're going to try and have a more optimistic approach to the end of this debate and talk about solutions that could perhaps buck the trend. Adrien, perhaps we could talk about France with you. Gala, we'll talk about the international scene with Latin America, but what could France put in place in order to increase birth rates? Well, solutions are going to be associated with the causes that we've developed. Even though I've heard the theorem by Lebrun in which there is no Holland effect, but when we asked people who are impacted, we asked them what could encourage birth rates. We hear people talking about autonomy. I think there's a real issue here is whether birth rate policies are there to increase fertility rates. And that would assume that women are the same today as they were 30 years ago in terms of their aspirations. But the question needs to be about how we're going to support women in order to be mothers while also being independent. And there's a whole number of different actions here to put in place. There is a whole number of fields. So the field of business, of course, this is a place where there's a real need for balance between professional life and personal life, and there's a need for gender equality. There's a whole number of initiatives associated with determining factors that are really clearly documented. So the parental leave for women, but also for men. There are a number of countries that are making, in Sweden, for example, this parental leave mandatory for fathers. Increasing numbers of companies are doing this in France now. We've gone beyond the limits put in place by the law recently. There's also a change, and needs to be a change, in the wage gap between men and women need to understand that having children will not lead to them losing income. Of course, company policies never express this in writing, but when you look in practice, you can see that there is an impact on women's salaries. So I think in business we can see that initiatives are being taken, but this is going to need to involve a legal approach to putting in place some laws, and this will not, but that will not cover all of the solutions. In the political level, when we ask families who don't have children and women who don't have children whether they want to, What do they ask for? What solutions are they asking for? Well, they're asking for economic solutions. They want to see fiscal advantages, particularly on income tax, for example, questions around support for housing benefits, and helping to have access to bigger housing when the family grows, support with childcare, all of these aspects which cost money. And perhaps at the end we could go into this a bit more, but we can see some really very specific propositions which are put in place. If I come back to the question of the medical approach, public policies are not just about funding, but public policies need to put subjects on the agenda. So the question of better exploring the health of women, this is something that's very important, and we need to create more and more healthcare networks and cross-cutting sectors that support women and families, because infertility doesn't only impact women, of course, in these areas. There's also the question of medically assisted procreation, which has become a political debate with a whole number of conservative perspectives expressed here, but this could be one of the solutions. And then there's also the question of who pays and who funds. I've got only 30 seconds left, so I can't really answer this question. But we could say, like we tend to say now, that we need to change the cursor this year for next year, but I don't think that's really a solution. What we need to think about is who gets a bonus. What's the bonus from an increase in birth rate? How does that impact people beneficially? I think there's two areas of the economy that are going to benefit from this. First of all, the world of business, because in questions of recruitment, AI is not a solution, or not the only solution. And also, for pensioners, this is also going to be important to increase birth rate. What I can see in the business world, that there's an increasing number of studies, and we can see, if I look at this economic sector, which is linked into insurance, and if I think about seniors in particular, where there's this idea that we shouldn't do anything that would be negative for them because these are people who vote. But I think we shouldn't consider that they are just egotistical. I think if we do that too that much, we just follow stereotypes. I think if we explain to our seniors, if we explain the situation of public finance and that this is going to require an effort from everybody, I think a project that supports the future of the country, children and grandchildren, I think there is a political consensus that can be found around this question of pensions. Gala, so Latin America is in a slightly different case, because there is still good birth rates, high birth rates there. So you've got a dividend in terms of high birth rates. So how can you maintain this dividend, and how can you avoid the errors that have been committed in Europe? How can you make the most of the situation for populations? It's true that in Latin America we still have a demographic dividend with a high level of the population that are of working age, but this window of opportunity will not last forever, and Argentina in particular is seeing a demographic transition which is increasing rapidly, with a very marked drop in birth rates. Since 2014 we've seen it drop by 43% to reach 1.36 children per woman in 2023. So this drop puts us below the demographic replacement rate, but also at the same level of China and beyond the mean value of Europe, France and the US. This drop has been particularly significant among women and adolescents, and it's a big point of progress necessary. So the window is open here, and how can we really benefit from this, and what are the solutions? So we need to put in place strategies, three-part strategies, or three promises that we need to maintain. So we need to make being a parent possible. Second, we need to promote productive work. And thirdly, we need to prepare for intergenerational solidarity. First of all, a promise to families. We need to ensure that having a family does not mean sacrificing your future. Ensuring in particular that women who want to have children can do so. This means reducing the burden of being a parent, in particular for women. It's essential to invest in healthcare policies that make sure that women can access time, having parental leave, etc., and also services, access to creches, to kindergartens, to childcare at a number of different levels. And we need to make it possible for women to be children. We also need to ensure that they have a dignified place in the working world. We need to make sure that people who are of working age can take part in the labor market. This requires the creation of jobs, but also an adequate workforce. For the first objective, we need to have a productive system focused on creating jobs. In the American system, where the primary extractive approach dominates, we need to think about value change that promotes job creation. In order to expand the offering, we need to remove inequalities. A lot of women leave the working world because of their childcare requirements. Opening up healthcare systems would help women to access. Third point is that we need to invest today to support tomorrow. Productivity is key here. It is crucial that people of working age produce more so that they can support an aging population. This invoices it's to guarantee a system for fair retreat. This tests social contrasts. We need to adapt our policies, and we're risking economic stagnation, but also a weakening of social cohesion. We need to understand that to prosper individually and collectively, social and institutional work is very necessary. So I'm really glad about this. I think we've got 2 minutes left. So if there's any questions in the room, you're going to have a microphone, so please do ask your question. Thank you very much. I'm from Action General of Quebec in Paris. So in Quebec, often there used to be 10 children per woman, and the average fertility rate was 4 children per woman. And after the Tranquil Revolution, in a decade, it went down, dropped to -2, and now it's 1.3. So this is associated with the role of religion in society. And I wanted to know whether in the different countries where we've seen this fertility rate drop, is there often an aspect associated with religious practices? Perhaps just a word on this. It's very difficult to prove this, but we can show that in France, only over the recent period, for this drop that has been going on over the last 10 years, it's the most religious département that have seen the most significant drop-off. So it's a very modest effect.
Dernière question, rapide.
So one last very quick question. Good afternoon. Good morning. I manage a think tank. You've talked about a number of different reasons, which don't seem, you've presented a number of specific regions, but it doesn't convince me because there is a general demographic decline around the world. So do you think that actually we don't know? Well, we know for different countries. So my neighbor has talked about Southeast Asia and has taught there are specific regions linked to marriage in Southeast Asia. There are specific reasons in Western Europe, which I've talked about. We've seen these questions associated with gender. There are specific reasons in Africa where we're starting to see this, which are also well known. Of course, there are different reasons, as you're saying, depending on countries, perhaps not on countries, but depending on groups of countries. So what we can see is general behavior across a whole group of countries, across the whole Sahel, for example, Equatorial Africa. There's similarities there, the whole of Southeast Asia, China, across the whole of China and Europe as a whole as well. Perhaps just to add something very briefly, is that the decision about births is now possible. So of course there are a number of different causes, but this phenomenon is in place because people can decide about whether they're going to have children or not. And it reduces the obstacles that people have to living the life that they want to live. So this means that there are less children. So I think the general answer is that now people can make a choice about whether to have children or not. It's not the only reason, but it is the factor that makes things possible. And then when a society doesn't change quickly enough in terms of women's aspirations. So you were talking about 2010, but there was a study from 1990 to today, and in terms of the number of children people want to have, there's been a significant drop-off, particularly for young people. So thank you to all of you. I think this is the time that we need to wrap up. Thank you for taking part in this workshop. Thank you very much.